Hey there, interwebs. Although today is Flag Day, this is not the next episode of Flag Shaming. That's what this video was going to be, but while creating the first draft of that script, I had written 4 pages, single-spaced, of historical context, misconceptions, and disclaimers without judging a single flag, so I thought, hey, let's turn this history lesson into an episode of How Fascinating. Don't worry, you'll still get that episode of Flag Shaming this Saturday, but today we'll focus on the history of the pirate flags. Ah, the Jolly Roger, an iconic design which has become inseparably linked to piracy, commonly known as the Skull and Crossbones because it looked like this. Or did it? I have seen it claimed in various places that the name Jolly Roger actually referred to the solid bloody red flag flown by pirates to indicate that they would give no quarter, and that its name was an anglicization of the name Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, used by French privateers. That's the claim, and although period sources do tell of pirates flying bloody red banners, I've seen no direct evidence tying them to the term Joli Rouge. But pirates still used the skull and crossbones, right? Well, the short answer is yeah, probably, but we'll likely never be 100% certain. That's because there are no surviving examples from the golden age of piracy, which lasted from approximately the 1650s to the 1730s. The closest examples we've got are these 3 flags. The one on the left was captured in the 1780s, half a century past the end of the era, while the one on the right is even newer, dated to the early 19th century, and the provenance of the one on the bottom is highly suspect. This means that to know what Golden Age pirate flags actually looked like, we're reliant on period accounts and artists' depictions, which are at best one step removed from the genuine article. When we're lucky, we get illustrations like this to work from, but other times we have to extrapolate a design based on descriptions, which are all too often fairly nebulous about the details. These aren't US state flags whose designs are written into law and specified down to the hex code for their field's particular shade of blue. They're hazy recollections of images recorded ex post facto. Someone saw a pirate flag, possibly flapping in the wind and while being attacked, and then they described what they think it looked like to someone else who wrote it down later. For example, in 1783, Scottish author William Falconer wrote that the colours usually displayed by pirates are laid to be a black field with a death's head, a battle-axe, and hourglass. This is one possible reconstruction provided by Wikimedia Commons, but when I first read the description, I pictured something more like this. You'll notice that Falconer made no mention of size, position, or even colour of any of the elements, so who can say what the original actually looked like? Basically, written records from the turn of the 18th century are spotty. Pictographic records are even spottier, and pictographic records of criminals attempting to avoid contact with reputable agencies aren't so much spotty as huge blotches of general ignorance upon a thin canvas of general history. Johnson's General History of Pirates, to be specific. This is the point where all the piratologists in the audience suddenly have a lot of mixed feelings. It's because Johnson's General History, or to use its full title, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, is the best and onlyest long-form period source on the subject, but on the other hand, or hook, it's also virtually guaranteed that the author took some creative liberties with the content, inventing details such as conversations to which he wasn't privy. We also don't know who the author was. The byline names Captain Charles Johnson, but the only record of someone by that name serving as a captain is from 42 years before the publication. With Johnson's credentials completely unknown and his creation rather fantastic at times, the overall veracity of A General History is dubious, but apart from the newspaper clippings, it's all we've got. Now, think fast. Which famous pirate flew this flag? Was it A. Charles Harris, B. Francis Spriggs, C. Edward Ned Lowe, D. Edward Blackbeard Teach, or E. John Phillips? If you said D. Blackbeard, you're wrong. Probably. I have to say probably because, while Blackbeard could have flown such a flag, we have no evidence that he did. The only existing record from Blackbeard's lifetime describing what flag he flew comes from a 1718 newspaper article recounting his attack on the Protestant Caesar. According to it, Blackbeard commanded a large ship and sloop with black flags and death's heads in them. Following on from this, the closest thing which we have to a period depiction of his flag comes from an illustration in Johnson's General History. In it, we can see what looks like a skull and crossbones on a dark background, but the accuracy of even this is debatable, since the engraving was made sometime around 1726 to 1736, roughly a decade after Blackbeard's death. The flag which many people erroneously associate with Blackbeard these days depicts a horned skeleton toasting the devil with one hand, and with the other spearing a heart to signify that no quarter would be given. It's cool, it's iconic, and these days it's instantly recognizable, but according to historian and noted piratologist E.T. Fox, it couldn't have been an 18th century design. Not the horned skeleton, at least. If the figure were meant to represent the devil, it wouldn't have been a skeleton, but if it was supposed to represent death, it wouldn't have horns. Instead, most pirate flags of the period would have used simple imagery based on Christian symbols of mortality. Here's the thing, though. The well-known modern iterations are based on a much more crude sketch from a 1912 article in the Mariner's Mirror, a nautical periodical, and when I look at it, I personally don't see a skeleton with 2 pairs of horns. I see a crown, and it was absolutely a trend in Christian art to show the personification of death as a skeleton with a crown and a war dart, such as we see here. Also, it's not making a toast. That's an hourglass, not a chalice, and the hourglass was another popular symbol of mortality. Much like skeletal elements, or skelements, it was a bit of memento mori, a reminder that humans are mortal beings, and a subtle threat that the metaphorical clock is ticking for you to surrender before Captain Blondebeard opens fire. The weapon stabbing a heart represents murder. What? Pirates aren't exactly known for subtlety. So where does that leave us? Was Blackbeard's flag nothing more than an early 20th century fiction, a vexillological fabrication made out of whole cloth? Metaphorically, of course. Well, not exactly. You see, I went a little manic researching this episode, but I believe that through my fervor I may have solved a mystery stretching back roughly 300 years. Namely, whose flag is this, really, and why do we misattribute it to Blackbeard? Let's start by going back 4 paragraphs. I told you that Blackbeard was the wrong answer to my question, who flew this flag, but any of the other 4 might have been correct. In 1723, Captain Charles Harris and his 25 crew members were hanged for piracy, and their flag was on display with their bodies. The contemporary newspaper, the New England Courant, reported its appearance as follows. Their black flag, with a portraiture of death having an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the other, at the end of which was the form of a heart with 3 drops of blood falling from it, was affixed at one corner of the gallows. This flag they called Old Roger, and often used to say that they would live and die under it. Johnson's General History states that they used a deep blue flag which had portrayed on the middle of it an anatomy with an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the heart with 3 drops of blood proceeding from it in the other. These descriptions of Harris's flag sound an awful lot like Blackbeard's supposed flag, minus the crown, and I find the fact that the 2 accounts are so similar but not quite the same to be more reassuring than if they matched word for word. The slight discrepancy leads me to believe that one was less likely to be simply regurgitating the report of the other, but the similarity of the details lends credibility to both, and to Johnson's General History as a whole. Naval historian Bennerson Little speculated that perhaps Harris wanted to be different or simply didn't have any black fabric to use, or maybe the once black flag had faded to a deep blue, which would also explain the nickname Old Roger instead of Jolly Roger. Johnson's General History also tells us that, a day or 2 after they parted, Spriggs was chosen captain by the rest, and a black ensign was made, which they called Jolly Roger, with the same device the Captain Low carried, viz. A white skeleton in the middle of it, with a dart in one hand striking a bleeding heart, and in the other an hourglass. Again, we have a flag of the general Blackbeard style, this time being attributed to Francis Spriggs, circa 1724 or 5. It also indirectly tells us that the flag of that design was used by Ned Low, who worked in piratical association with Charles Harris. That same year, the Boston Newsletter described the Jolly Roger of John Phillips as a dark flag, in the middle of which an anatomy, and at one side of it a dart in the heart, with drops of blood proceeding from it, and on the other side an hourglass. This artist's interpretation was furnished through Wikimedia, but the paper's description could also match the designs of Harris, Spriggs, and Low, which I believe was more likely to have been the case. This design has been attributed to John Quelch in recent years, and popular myth claims that it was known as Old Roger, and therefore the origin of the term Jolly Roger, but all of that seems to have been invented by the 20th century journalist Ralph Delahaye Payne. None of the testimony from Quelch's 1704 trial makes reference to any sort of Jolly Roger, and his crew asserted that the flag of England had been flown at all times. Quelch aside, that's still 4 notable pirates whose flags fit the skeleton with an hourglass and a dart stabbing a heart motif, and it seems to have been one of the more popular shared designs for historical Jolly Rogers. Modern sources make the baseless claim that Low et al. Adopted the design from Blackbeard, who had died roughly 5 years prior, but according to E.T. Fox, the design was likely first connected to Blackbeard by Douglas Botting in his 1978 book, The Pyrates, and he probably took it from this sketch in the 1912 edition of The Mariner's Mirror. The accompanying text read as follows. In the Book of Buried Treasure, R.D. Payne, 1911, is to be found the following. A flag was hoisted, called Old Roger, described as having in the middle of it an anatomy, skeleton, with an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the heart with 3 drops of blood proceeding from it in the other. This description is from a quotation from an account of John Quelch, a pirate executed at Boston in 1704. There is a photographic reproduction of a watercolor drawing of this pattern of flag, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris, in Armée et Marine, 1900, of which the enclosed sketch is a copy. That quote takes a little effort to unpack, but I want you to note the 2 names mentioned, R.D. Payne and John Quelch. Basically, the caption is explaining that this is a sketch of a photograph of a watercolor, and the description comes from Payne's account of the execution of John Quelch. But if Quelch's use of the flag was made up by Ralph Payne, where did he get the idea? I believe that, as a man obviously intrigued by pirates, Payne may have read Johnson's general history and lifted the design from there. Putting it all together, we end up with a timeline which looks something like this. Blackbeard was active from 1716 to 1718. Edward Lowe and others flew this flag in the early 1720s, and descriptions survived in period newspapers and Charles Johnson's A General History of Pirates. Ralph Delahaye Payne probably read one or more of these accounts and wrongly attributed the design to John Quelch in 1911, and a sketch based on a watercolor depiction of it was published in the Mariner's Mirror in 1912, leading Douglas Botting to connect the design to Blackbeard in 1978, 260 years after the pirate's death. Since then, people have assumed that Edward Lowe's flag was based on Blackbeard's, but it was probably the other way around. The flag commonly attributed to Blackbeard is actually based on Edward Lowe's. The design only made its way to Blackbeard in what is essentially a 3-century-long vexillological game of Whisper Down the Lane. Of course, this flag and the classic Death's Head Jolly Roger weren't the only piratical flags flown during the Golden Age. There were also the personal flags of Henry Morgan, Thomas Tew, Walter Kennedy, Jean-Thomas Dulain, Christopher Moody, Calico Jack Rackham, Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, Jacot Back from the Dead Red Delahaye, the Gentleman Pirate Stede Bonnet, and the King Pirate Henry Avery. All of these designs are historically accurate and correctly attributed, right? Right? Well, let's start with Captain Henry Morgan. Yes, the one the rum is named after. I don't know where the idea got started, but I have seen a flag of this design attributed to him in various places. We can be fairly certain he never flew such a flag, however, because he was a mid-17th century English privateer, that is to say, a pirate essentially working under government contract. As such, he would have simply flown the English flag. A similar flag with a skull and crossbones on a red field is oft attributed to a different Henry, Henry Avery. Also known as Henry Avery, John Avery, Jack Avery, Benjamin Bridgman, and Long Ben, Avery's case is more difficult to untangle because there are no reliable contemporary accounts of his flag, and yet he has anywhere from 0 to 4 to his name. This is the design most commonly attributed to him, with a field of either red or black, but it's anachronistic, according to Fox, as the distinctive hoop, earring, and bandana weren't associated with pirates until artists such as N.C. Wyeth and Howard Pyle popularized the look in the latter 19th century. In the background of this woodcut made for Johnson's General History, we can see a black flag with a pair of crossed leg bones, but this is probably artistic license, since Avery would have been in his late 60s, or more likely dead, by its publication in 1725. Additionally, there is a poem titled A Copy of Verses, anonymously composed in 1694 but attributed to Avery, in which the narrator states, "Four chevillages of gold in a bloody field, environed with green, now this is my shield." But this is almost certainly a reference to heraldry, not vexillology. Perhaps the best evidence that Avery didn't fly a pirate flag, however, is his period of operation. His career ended when he disappeared without a trace in 1696, before the era of Jolly Rogers began, circa 1700. We encounter a similar issue of timeliness with the flag of Thomas Tew. That's Thomas T-E-W, not Thomas, T-O-O. His career also predated Jolly Rogers, lasting from 1692 to 1695, but unlike Avery's flags, this design would not have been out of place in the 1690s. Black flags have been flown by pirates and privateers since at least 1585, and the arm and sword was a well-used symbol in the 17th century. Unfortunately, there's no record of this flag existing or belonging to Tew, which predates Botting's 1978 book, so it's quite likely he made it up. The same can be said for the alleged flags of Calico Jack Rackham and Stede Bonnet. The latter worked closely with Blackbeard for 2 years, and much like his literal partner in crime, Bonnet was also described by period sources as flying black flags and a Death's Head flag in 1718. In Johnson's General History, he is shown with the standard skull and crossbones. Next up, we have the flags of Captains Kennedy and John Thomas Dulain. A 1727 letter from J. Evans to Charles Johnson described the flag of one Captain Kennedy as a black ensign with the figure of a man with a sword in his hand and an hourglass before him with a death's head and bones. Dulain's flag is described as black with white markings in the form of heads cut off with a cutlass, the rest bones and sand glasses. The mayor of Nantes, however, described Dulain's flag as a black cloth with white designs of a human figure, cutlass, bones, and hourglasses. It's possible that these two descriptions apply to the same flag, and this illustration was made in period in 1729. Dulain's career lasted from 1727 to 28, coeval with the Evans letter. While it is unclear whether the Captain Kennedy named in it was Walter Kennedy, who had been killed 6 years prior, it is my belief that this flag is the true flag of Dulain, not Kennedy as is generally claimed, and that this flag frequently attributed to Dulain is a more recent invention. This flag is frequently misattributed to Christopher Moody, and we can be certain it's misattributed because he was never a captain and therefore wouldn't have possessed his own flag. He does, however, have the dubious distinction of the most unflattering Wikipedia introduction. Christopher Moody was a pirate as a member of Bartholomew Roberts' crew, but was never a captain in his own right. He is best known not for his own actions, but for a popular Jolly Roger flag misattributed to him, as well as for later authors confusing him with the unrelated pirate William Moody. Oof. Although this flag was first misattributed to him in 1933 in Charles Gray's Pirates of the Eastern Seas, the design itself seems to hail from 1746 and could have been an authentic mid-18th century creation. The winged hourglass is a visual pun representing the Latin idiom tempus fugit, time flies. Less historical is this design, attributed to Jacquot back from the dead red de la Haye. It was almost certainly never used by her, because she almost certainly didn't exist. No period sources make reference to her, and the earliest records of her exploits come from Léon Treich, a French fiction writer of the 1940s. De la Haye's fictional flag is also suspiciously similar to one allegedly used by another famous pirate. On that note, last but certainly not least, we have Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, the pirate who probably had the most flags to his name, with between 5 and 8 confirmed designs in the course of his less than 4-year career. The man went through flags faster than I go through shoes, and yet this design, which depicts Captain Roberts in death holding aloft an hourglass and with which he has become most associated, was probably not among them. Some have claimed that Roberts is raising a toast to death, but I find this unlikely, given the hourglass's established symbolism and Roberts' teetotal habits. Although there are no known period sources attributing this flag to Roberts, the design seems to come from 2 other images, or rather 1.5. That half of an image is this, where we can see what is clearly Death holding a dart in one hand and reaching out with the other. Unfortunately, we can only see the other half of the flag in this image from Johnson's general history, which isn't clear. I'll be the first to admit that there's some squinting around corners going on here, but to me it looks more like Roberts is brandishing a sword at Death, not holding aloft a glass. The book also tells us that Roberts had a flag which showed the figure of a skeleton in it, and a man portrayed with a flaming sword in his hand, intimating a defiance of death itself. I think that's the flag we're looking at in these 2 engravings. And there you have it. Many of the most popular pirates' flags are misattributed, if not outright fabrications from the 20th century. That being said, it still won't stop me from judging them on their own merits alongside genuine historical designs in the next installment of Flag Shaming, which will come out this Saturday. I hope to see you there, and until then, have a fascinating Flag Day. The real Jolly Rogers. Sebastian, I am trying to record a video. This is hardly the time.